Hello, people of God. Have you ever complained about someone or something? I think we've all complained at some point in our life. Complaining can become a dangerous habit. There are people who complain so often, they don't even realize they're doing it anymore. They complain about everything, from the weather, to how food tastes, to how the air smells, to what somebody else is wearing. Complain, complain, complain! So why do people complain? According to some life coaches, people complain out of habit. They complain to find common ground or to validate their beliefs. People complain to avoid taking action or to avoid taking responsibility. Sometimes we complain because we cannot control the circumstances and we simply don't know what else to do. We know something isn't right. We know we can't do anything about it, but we want someone else to acknowledge our situation. So we complain. Sound familiar? If we're complaining to the right person, we just might get solution to our problem. But if we're not complaining to the right person, we're just complaining. Who's listening to us complain? In today's story of the people of God, the complaining begins. Up to this point, the people have been following Moses as he leads them out of Egypt. There has been some action, and there's been some jubilation, and now there is complaining. Turn to Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 to 15, to read the story of a bunch of hungry, frightened people. And then join me for another look at what is happening in this story. At first glance, we see the people of God have been in the wilderness for a month or so. They're complaining against Moses and Aaron, the men who were leading them. But notice, the people aren't complaining about God. They're complaining about Moses, and Moses doesn't want any of the blame. Friends, we need to slow down when we read this passage. We think we know the story, we remember it, but the word "you" is thrown around with great frequency. So it's easy to lose track of who the "you" is referencing. So let's break it down together. Let's slow down and understand who's doing the complaining and who's responding. In verses 2 and 3, the Israelites are complaining that Moses has led them to the wilderness and that they're now starving. They would rather go back to Egypt. Even if life was bad there, at least they had plenty of food. In verses 4 and 5, God talks to Moses. God has heard the people complaining and responds to their leader. God explains that God will provide bread from heaven, enough for each day. God also explains that this will be a test. Will the people follow God's instructions? And then God institutes the Sabbath, reminding us of creation when God rested on the seventh day. In verses 6 to 8, Moses tells the people that God is the one leading them. He makes a promise that the people will see the glory of the Lord, which, by the way, God did not say God was going to do. Moses tells him he adds this in just as a bonus, just as justification. And then Moses tells them, just like God said, you'll receive the food in the morning and in the evening. He gets his digs in on the people. He tells them pretty plainly, you aren't really complaining about me, you're complaining about God. He repeats that the people should not have a quarrel with him or with Aaron, that their complaints truly are with God. Notice that Moses here, Moses does not mention the test or God's Sabbath. Those details come out much, much later, not even in this reading. So here we have Moses adding things and not telling everything. Moses has added that God's going to show up with some glory. And then Moses has said nothing about the test and nothing about the Sabbath. In verses 9 and 10, the people do see the glory of God in the cloud. Even though God hadn't said that God would show up this way, God did. And the people needed to see God's presence among them. Moses wanted the people to see that God was at work in this, to know that the food they were about to receive truly came from God. Moses was thinking, adding this part in, and God recognized the need of the people of God to see the presence of God. In verses 11 and 12, God has another little talk with Moses, and again God recognizes the people's complaints and repeats the promise for food. And verse 13 through 15, fulfills the promise. Each evening there was an abundance of quail, and each morning there was bread from heaven scattered on the ground. As the people encountered this bread for the very first time, they asked, "What is it?" In Hebrew, "what is it?" is translated as manna. This passage repeats the theme of complaining and provision. It offers us the intersection of human need and divine generosity. This is where human greed meets divine grace. This story offers us so much more than complaining about being hungry. It shows us, it's evidence of the way that God provides. Let that sink in. This is where human need and divine generosity cross. But what is the need in this story? The people have been complaining about being hungry, but there's also something else in their complaints. They never complain to God. They never complain about God. They need to recognize God's presence in the story. Now, if you have been churched most of your life, you can probably fill in some more details in this story that extend beyond the reading of the verses we've encountered today. You probably know that each day the people gathered exactly what they needed for that day, and that there was a requirement of how much they could gather per person. If you gathered a little bit less or a little bit more, it always turned out that you had exactly what you needed. Now, we also, if you've read ahead or if you know the story, you know that the people who wanted to do a little extra work so they'd have a day off, if they were collecting more than they needed and tried to store it, when they would get up the next day, what they had stored would be moldy and rotten. God gave them what they needed for each day. The only day they could gather more, they could gather twice as much the day before the Sabbath, so that on the Sabbath they could rest. Again, Moses didn't tell them that detail about the Sabbath until later. The test in this story was learning to trust God to provide what was needed when it was needed. And this is a perpetual test for the people of God. It's our test. Do we trust God to provide what we need when we need it? Or do we complain about our circumstances, about God, about the lack of provision? How often are our prayers telling God what to do instead of trusting God with what's on our hearts? This story of manna from heaven. In this story, the people didn't complain to or about God. They complained to one another about someone else, about Moses. They complained to each other about their hunger, about their circumstance. They complained because they wanted what had always been, because it was known. The people were in Egypt for 400 years, And this was what they knew. They were complaining about the good old days. They were complaining that those days were gone. They were complaining because their future was uncertain. The idea of a test, the idea of being free was a great idea. But the cost of freedom was suddenly more than they wanted to pay. So they complained to each other about Moses. Who do we complain about? What do we complain about? Do we complain because we miss the good old days? Who's listening when we complain? Who can help fix our problems? In this story, God was listening. Remember that early in Volume 1 in the story of the people of God? Here we are in Volume 4, and that lesson comes to fruition once more. In this story of the people of God, God is listening to God's people. God was always listening. And God heard what was being said and what was not being said. It wasn't just food for their bellies that the people needed. They needed reassurance that God was in control, that they really weren't lost and wandering, that they weren't alone. They needed something to believe in. They needed hope. And they really needed to learn to trust in God. Somehow, the people had forgotten their God really was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel, the God of Joseph, the God who found a way to feed them in the midst of the famine. This was the God that was leading them to the promised land. But there was a test. Do you trust God, people of God? Let's test that with the basics. Let's test that trust with food, with bread from heaven. And then we'll test that trust with the real bread from heaven, with Jesus Christ. Friends, I detest the idea that God is testing us. This is the language that we see so clearly in Exodus 16:4. And that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instructions or not. But to me, it's not so much a test as it is an invitation. It's an invitation to exercise our free will. We can follow God's instructions or not. We can trust God or not. We can believe in Jesus Christ or not. We can complain about where we are compared to where we've been. We can complain about what we have or have not. We can even assign blame for our circumstances to others. Why do we complain? To commiserate with one another, to validate our circumstances, to avoid taking responsibility, to quietly acknowledge we don't know what else to do. Perhaps we complain because we know deep in our heart that God is listening. God will always acknowledge our situation, and God will provide. What is it God will provide? Manna. Manna means, what is it? What is it God will provide? God will provide manna. Exactly what is it we need? Friends, manna is more than bread. In the story of the people of God wandering through the wilderness, we can see human need being met with divine generosity. We can see hunger being met with bread. We can see fear being met with God's grace. And we can see hope being born. This is not really the story about complaining Israelites or a test from God. This is a story about God's presence and God's provision for the people of God. This is our story, a story of hope. Whatever your needs may be, whatever complaints are in your hearts or on your lips, may you be met with God's generosity of provision, God's abundant grace, God's divine hope. May you be met with manna from heaven. Thanks be to God.